Okay, great. So that basically concludes the neighborhoods, like very micro part of the class where we were focused on different small parts of the country. And now what we're going to do is zoom out, in some sense, at a very broad level, go back to the national level, and even look at the international level to understand how children's chances of climbing up have evolved historically and how they compare in the US versus other countries. Okay, so as a bit of background to connect it to what we were talking about before, so until now, we've focused primarily on a snapshot of rates of upward mobility for kids growing up in America today. So I think of this as basically, kids in your generation or slightly before that. As we just discussed, though, in the previous slide, a historical perspective is often useful in understanding the determinants of current outcomes. So why are we interested in studying history? It's often a useful way to learn about what is going on in the present. Now, I mentioned at the end of the previous segment is that we can't yet study trends in mobility by neighborhood because we don't have historical data linking parents to kids where we can analyze kids' outcomes in every single neighborhood in the past. However, we have actually made some progress in understanding mobility over time at a national level. And so that's what I'm going to talk about in this section of the class, right? So just to define the perspective we're going to take in looking at these trends in mobility. So there are many different ways in which you can measure mobility. Historically, the American dream, the way people have thought about economic mobility, I think it's kind of in the DNA of the American social fabric, is the aspiration that kids should have higher standards of living than their parents, right? So the idea that no matter what your family background, as long as you work hard, America is a country where every kid has a chance of moving up relative to their parents in terms of how much they're earning, in terms of their standard of living. So, how can you see that? If you ask people to assess economic progress, like, do you think you're making progress economically? The most common thing, if you just ask people that question in a survey, most common thing they'll do is compare their earnings to their parents. So if you ask people, are you doing well economically, a very common frame of reference is for kids to compare their level of earnings to their parents. So you can see that, from that level, it seems like an intuitive way to think about it. Another example of that, President Obama in one of his speeches said, people's frustrations, speaking about the current state of the US economy, are partly rooted in the fear that their kids won't be better off than they are. So again, getting at this idea that doing better than your parents, what we call absolute mobility across generations, is really a central thing that people care about, okay? So motivated by that, the statistic that we're going to focus on measuring in the data is what fraction of children earn more than their parents, and how has that changed over time? So very simple idea, right? Just like take 100 kids, how many of them are earning more than their parents? We just want to compute that. And you'll recognize that this is actually the very first chart that I started out this class with. It was the fading American dream chart was the answer to that question. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about that work in more detail and what we learned from it. Everything I'm talking about in the next few slides, if you want to look at it in more detail, comes from this science paper with my colleagues that was published in 2017. Okay, so let's start with this Brookings summary. So how many people are better off than their parents? So before we did this work and before we had access to this new data, the answer is nicely summarized in this paper by Halakakis and Richard Reeves, where they basically say it depends upon how you cut the data. There were a bunch of earlier studies that tried to answer, what seems like a totally, very simple question, right? Turns out, though, that you get very different answers depending upon which data sets you use, which methods you use. It was very unclear what the answer to that simple question actually was, let alone how it's changing over time or what the drivers were and things like that. Okay, so why were people having such a hard time answering that question? Because fundamentally, nobody had, or actually even currently has, data linking parents to kids historically. So you're able to see from the census, which has been collected going back decades in the United States, you can see the average incomes of people in 1940, 1950, 1960, and so on. But you cannot link kids to their parents in those data sets. And so that makes it difficult, obviously, to answer the question of whether kids are doing better than their parents. So in this paper that we're going to talk about here, we developed a method of estimating historical rates of mobility even in the absence of having these parent-child links. So that might sound a bit weird. How are you able to do that even if you're not able to connect parents to kids? So what I'm going to do is first describe the basic results that we find, and then I'll come back to just illustrate in a simple way our statistical methodology that allows us to make progress on this problem. And this paper more broadly illustrates how often when we're tackling social science questions, we don't have access to the perfect data that we'd like to answer the question we're seeking to answer. But the power of statistics and economic methodology is often that you can find clever ways around the obstacles that you face, and this will be an illustration of that, as you'll see. Okay, so let's start by just showing you what we find in the data first. So I'm going to show you a series of figures that look like this. X-axis is, as in many of the charts we've looked at, parent income percentile. So where do your parents rank in the income distribution? And then the y-axis is now this statistic that we're interested in computing. What fraction of kids go on to earn more than their parents did? Okay? And we're starting with data for kids born in 1940. And so what you can see here is that in 1940, for essentially kids in the entire income distribution, more than 95% of them went on to earn more than their parents did. And just to be clear, when I say earn more than their parents did, we're measuring the parents' incomes when their parents were approximately 30 years old. We're measuring kids' incomes when the kids were approximately 30 years old. So that is, for this group, when in 1970, right? Kids were born in 1940. We're measuring their incomes in about 1970. And we're adjusting for inflation between those two periods, okay? Kind of put it on a level playing field. So with those definitions, see that it's essentially across the income distribution, kids are doing better than their parents. It comes down at the very top. So why is that? That's totally intuitive, right? If your parents were making $1 million a year, it's less likely that you're going to earn more than your parents, right? So naturally, that statistic is going to come down at the very top of the distribution. If your parents are very high income, the odds that you will do better than your parents are going to fall, okay? So that's what you'd expect. But the main point is that by and large, this is very high rate. Okay, so now let's recompute that statistic for 1950. 1950, here, you see it's come down to about 85%, 80%, something like that. 1960, 1970, and 1980. And so you see a dramatic and steady drop in the fraction of kids who are doing better than their parents across essentially the entire income distribution, and especially in the middle class, right? For kids born to parents between like the 40th and 60th percentile, there's just a dramatic reduction in the odds that you are going to do better than your parents. So you can take all of these statistics, which are computed separately for each parent income percentile, and just collapse them to a single number. You can ask, on average, what fraction of the kids born in 1940 ended up doing better than their parents did. And the answer to that, if you just look across this and just take an average over that blue curve, the answer to that turns out to be 92%. You can do that calculation not just for the kids born in 1940, you can do it for the kids born in 1941, 1942, and so forth. And that's what this chart is. This is the chart that we started the lectures with, right? So the first dot is at 92%. And then now we're computing that statistic not just for the decadal years that I was showing you in the previous plot, but for every birth year. And you see a pattern very consistent with what I showed you before. The fraction of kids doing better than their parents has steadily declined in the United States. Okay, so the American dream has, in some sense, faded. Okay, so that's the fact. So now how do we actually manage to compute that fact, compute that series, even though we don't have data linking parents to their kids? If we, just to be clear, if we did have data linking parents to their kids on incomes, this would be a completely straightforward computation, right? I would just literally imagine this big spreadsheet of kids' incomes and parents' incomes, and I would just calculate the fraction of cases where the kids are earning more than their parents. It would be completely trivial. So here we've got to figure out some way to do it, given that we don't know which kids are associated with which parents in each year, okay? And so how are we able to do that? The fundamental reason we're able to make progress on this problem is that it turns out that almost all the kids born in 1940 ended up earning more than all the parents in the previous generation. And so it ends up actually not mattering which kids are linked to which parents. So let me give you an illustration that hopefully will make that point clear. So what we're doing here is plotting the income distribution of parents in the blue and kids in the red for children born in the 1940 birth cohort. So that is, take all the kids born in 1940. What this red curve is a depiction of the distribution of income for children born in 1940. So this is basically a density of a distribution. For those of you who haven't seen that before, basically think of it as where the red curve is higher, you have more people in that range, and where it's lower, you have fewer people. So think of it as, it's basically analogous to the count of the number of kids who have incomes in each of these different parts, right? So you have lots of kids earning around $50,000 a year, you have relatively few kids earning close to zero, and you have relatively few kids earning more than $150,000 a year for the kids born in 1940 when we measure their incomes at age 30, okay? Similarly, the density for the parents is constructed in the same way, just giving you a sense of where the parents' incomes are. So the key thing to note here is that these two distributions are almost non-overlapping. So to give you one example, if I were to look at the 80th percentile of the parent income distribution, so that's $27,000 a year, 80% of parents earned less than $20,000 a year, okay? But if you look at the kids distribution, $27,000 a year actually corresponds to just the 14th percentile. That is to say, 86% of children ended up earning more than $27,000 a year. So when you've got the situation where basically all kids are earning more than all parents, so to put it starkly, it's almost like the lowest income kid born in 1940 earned more than the highest income parent. Imagine for a moment that that's what the picture looked like. Suppose the red distribution was completely separated from the blue. Suppose it was strictly to the right of it, okay? So in that world, the very lowest income kid would be earning more than the highest income parent in the previous generation. If that was the situation, it would be completely irrelevant which kids were linked to which parents, because you would know that the fraction of kids earning more than their parents has to be 100%, right? Because every single kid earns more than every single parent. It doesn't matter which kid is born to which parent, whatever that is, you're gonna get an absolute upward mobility rate of 100%. So now in practice, you're not in quite that extreme of a situation. There are some kids who end up earning less than the previous parents' generation, but it's relatively few of them. And so as a result, we show in the paper that, think of it intuitively as you can think about all the different ways you link kids to parents. The range of rates of absolute upward mobility you get varies from something like 85% to 100%. So even though you don't know for sure that the number is 92%, you're pretty sure it's quite high. And that's just because of the nature of the income distributions, that income went up so much across the board from one generation to the next that you know that absolute mobility had to be really high. So that turns out to work historically, but it is not the case for the kids born in the 1980s, where you see a very different picture, and I'll show you that in a second, but fortunately for the kids born in the recent generation, we do actually know which kids are linked to which parents. And so you don't need to use this more subtle method that I just described. So in particular, if you do the chart that I just showed you before for kids born in 1980, now you see a very different picture, right? If you look at the parents' distribution and the kids' distribution, they look much more similar to each other. In particular, if you look at the point, the 80th percentile of the parents' distribution, that is now $80,000. 80% of parents earn less than $80,000 among kids born in the 1980s. But that same 80,000 number, it's only the 74th percentile of the kids' income distribution. That is to say, only 26% of kids earn more than that amount. And so when you're in this world, it's going to matter a ton which kids are linked to which parents. If the high-income kids are linked to high-income parents, you could end up having much lower rates of absolute mobility than if there was a different set of linkages in the economy. But for the kids born in 1980, we do actually know which children are born to which parents, and so we can exactly compute the statistic directly. So it turns out basically because of a coincidence of what happened in the US economy with the data we happen to have available, we're able to compute those rates of absolute mobility pretty reliably, despite not having a full picture of what happened historically. Okay, and so the punchline of that, stepping back now from the methods to think about what we actually learned from this exercise, we see that rates of upward mobility have fallen dramatically in the United States. And so then you can next ask, what policies can increase upward mobility in the US given the dramatic decline in rates of upward mobility that we've seen, okay? And so that's what I'm going to turn to. So in order to, sorry, before I do that, any questions on what I just talked about the basic fact about the decline in absolute mobility? Yeah. Yeah, so good question. So let me just come back to this chart for a second. So, you might worry that 1940 is a unique period, not just coming out of the Great Depression. You've got the war, various things, very different part of US history. So should we be thinking about like what is normal as 1940? Or is it that 1940 was kind of unusual and what's more normal is what we're seeing in more recent years? So two answers to that. First, there's no sense in which 1940 plays some special role here, right? You could just drop the early years and just say compare 1950 to 1980 and you still see a pretty dramatic decline. So it's not like it's just 1940 or the very earliest years that are exceptional relative to the later period. I think you see a pretty relatively smooth decline throughout this period. The second thing that you might worry about is when we look at people born in 1940, we're measuring their parents' incomes when they were 30 years old. So typically you're measuring their parents' incomes in the 40s or maybe 1950. And so you could worry that measuring the parents' incomes then leads to certain biases. So a different way we do it is don't measure the parents' incomes when they were 30 years old, measure the parents' incomes when they were 40 years old, and the kids' incomes when they were 40 years old. And so that kind of pushes you away from that era a little bit, and you end up getting a picture that's pretty similar. So my take is not that, I think your point is right, that part of what's going on here could be driven by coming out of the Great Depression, the war, et cetera. But it's a broader phenomenon than that. It's not like that's a one-time blip, okay? Yeah, good question. So I actually can't answer that question by race because we don't have the historical data to break this down by race. It's something we'll be able to do once we have more data. I can answer that question by gender. And so what ends up happening is if you look at men versus their fathers, you see an even steeper decline. So 35% of men today are earning more than their dads did. So it's an incredibly steep decline for men. For women, there's still a decline, but in some periods it actually goes in the other direction, which makes perfect sense because women were entering the labor force in large numbers over this period, right? So lots of moms were not working, daughters start working, and so then you're going to see it going the other direction. But even despite that, for women, you don't see like a big upward trend. So there are big gender differences, but I think when you look at men in particular and you think about some of the challenges that the US is facing, who's expressing the greatest frustration, that sharp decline for men, I think, lines up with that. Yeah?
I think my question is similar to like 2 questions ago. I look at these charts and I see, well, the rate of economic
Yeah.
basis. So how do you then take that and say, like, is there any cause, actually any real cause to be concerned about, oh, there's lower social mobility now?
Yeah.
Because that condition is significant, it's different.
Yeah. Excellent question, and that's actually perfect segue to what I'm going to talk about next. So economic growth versus changes in inequality. That's exactly what I'm going to address, as you'll see. So there are two major changes, as you've noted, in the American economy since 1940. If you look at the macro economy, big picture level, what are some of the major trends in the US? First, as you just said, you have lower total economic growth rates. The size of GDP, total size of the economy, the rate of growth has slowed. And second, you have a less equal distribution of that growth. So the growth that we've had has gone primarily to higher income people rather than lower income people. So just to show you those facts, I'm going to turn to some data from a very nice book called The Race Between Education and Technology by my colleagues Claudia Golden and Larry Katz. And so what they're doing in this simple bar chart here is asking how much did average family income grow depending upon where you started out, okay? And they're first going to show you the data between 1947 and 1973. And so if you take this first bar here, what it's telling you is that for people who were in the bottom quintile, that is the bottom fifth of the income distribution, their incomes grew on average by 3% per year between 1947 and 1973. So 3% per year is quite a bit, right? So 3% per year means that in about something like 25 years, your income is going to double. And so over this period, your income is more than doubled for that group. Now, if you look across the distribution, you pretty much see a constant, roughly 3% growth rate per year throughout this period between 47 and 73. Now, exactly as you noted, if you now repeat that analysis for the period from 1973 to 2013, the more modern era, you see a very different pattern. First, as you pointed out, you have lower rates of growth. Okay, so the red bars are generally just lower than the blue bars. So that's point number one, slower growth of total income. And then the second point, which is very clear, is that the distribution of that growth is extremely different. If you look at the top of the distribution, the growth in income is not that much slower, actually, for people in the top 5% relative to the prior era. Whereas if you look at the middle and the bottom of the distribution, you actually see, in some cases, zero growth, or at the very bottom, even negative growth, meaning incomes are lower in 2013 than they were in 1973. Okay, so two big changes in the American economy in the past 30 years relative to before, lower growth rates and growing inequality. Now, in this chart, you see the growing inequality, broken down by the top 20% versus the top 5%. So in the data Claudia and Larry were looking at, and people looked at in the past, that was kind of the best breakdown that you could do with the available information. It was hard to get at the very richest Americans. The most recent work in this area breaks the data down in a much, much finer way. So in a series of quite famous studies by Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, more recently Gabriel Zuckman, they construct charts like what I was just showing you before, but basically think of it as, instead of breaking it into 5 broad groups, they break it into each percentile. And they do this using information from tax returns, similar to the type of data we've been talking about in this class. So again, think of this as like the big data version of the chart that we saw before. And what you see when you do it that way is a picture that is qualitatively consistent with what we saw before, which makes sense. It's describing the same period. But you see a very sharp difference at the very top, okay? So let's just focus on each series in turn. So start with the gray series. That's in 1980. It's looking at income growth rates in 1980 by the level of income where you were in the income distribution in 1980. And so what you can see is summarized in this chart by David Leonhardt in the New York Times. He says the poor and the middle class used to see the largest income growth, so kind of that 3% number that we saw before. And then you see it declining slightly to something like 2% at the top. But then if you repeat that chart in 2014, you see a dramatically different picture where you see, as we were seeing before, basically zero growth or essentially no growth at the bottom in the middle of the income distribution, and then higher growth that we were seeing around the 90th percentile. But then what was missed in the earlier analysis is that there's this enormous amount of growth at the very, very top, right? So people, at the very top of the income distribution, like the 99.99th percentile, their incomes have been growing at more than 6% per year. 6% per year means your income's going to double every 12 years. So over like a 30-year period, you're talking about something like an 8-fold increase in income. Just to give you, a better visual sense of that, I'm going to toggle over to this here. Let's see if this works. Yeah, so this is an animated version of that chart showing you how this changes across years. And so you can see how, starts out relatively flat in the 80s, and then the 90s, it's starting to pick up. In the 2000s, growth is just shooting up at the very, very top of the income distribution, as opposed to the general rich. So what is the top 1%? You have to earn at least $450,000 a year or so to be in the top 1%. To be in the top 1%, 0.1%, so 1 in 1,000, you have to have an income above something like $1 million or a couple $1 million a year to be in the very, very upper tail. And those incomes are going up tremendously, okay? So what this shows you is that, come back here, sorry. What this shows you is that there's been a tremendous change both in growth and in terms of inequality. And the change in inequality, just to put it in a different way that has captured a lot of national attention in its own right, can also be thought about in this way. So in this quite well-known chart, Piketty and Saez plot the share of income going to households that are in the top 1%. So this is basically saying, suppose I take the total amount of income earned by everyone in the United States, that's a certain X trillion dollars, right, each year, and I ask what fraction of those trillions of dollars go to people who are in the top 1%. That is the 1 out of the 100 richest Americans. So you can see that that number in the 1920s and 1930s was around 18 to 20%. So that was an era of substantial inequality where you had a few people with a tremendous amount of income. And then that ended up falling quite sharply in the US in the middle of the last century, down to something like 10 or even 8%. And then since the 1980s, exactly like I've been showing you in other ways, the share of income going to the top 1% has increased dramatically, such that now you have something like, again, about 20% of income going to the 1% of people in the top 1%, right? So it's kind of a 20-fold representation in a sense relative to the average person. So it's another way of showing you the statistics that I've just been showing you about how there are big changes in growth, as you pointed out, but there are also significant changes in inequality. So just so you see how this plays out, this kind of data I think is extremely important in understanding what's going on. It's also captured public attention. So the Occupy Wall Street movement, We Are the 99%, was in large part motivated by that type of evidence, right? That there's substantial change in the distribution of income today relative to the past, and a lot of people are very frustrated about that. Okay, so coming back to the issue now of upward mobility, we've got these two broad trends in the economy: lower growth rates, growing inequality. What we want to understand is how much of the decline in the American dream that we've been seeing is due to a reduction in growth, the hypothesis you would put forth, versus changes in inequality, changes in the distribution of growth. And what you'll see is that both of these things seem quite important. Okay, and so the way that I'm going to analyze that is by considering two hypothetical scenarios for kids born in 1980. The first is a higher growth scenario. So imagine that you had a growth rate since birth that corresponded to what you saw in the earlier period, that corresponded to what kids born in 1940 experienced. But imagine that that higher growth rate of 3% instead of 1.5% was distributed in the same way that it is today, with much more of the money going to the top 1% rather than the rest of the distribution. Okay, so the way I like to think about that is, imagine the pie is growing faster like it was in the past, but I cut the pie in the same way that I'm cutting it today. So that's hypothetical scenario number one. Hypothetical scenario number two is what I call more broadly shared growth. So here we keep the growth rates the same as they are today, average of like 1.7, 1.8%, but we cut the pie in the way that we were cutting it back in the 1940s, with more of the growth going to the middle class and the lower class, all right? So what would these two scenarios do? So coming back to the chart that I was showing you when we started talking about this work, this is what kids' chances of doing better than their parents look like for the kids born in 1980. This is the actual data. This is the actual data for 1940. So now imagine we had the scenario where we had higher growth rates. We just restored growth magically to what it was in the past. What would that series look like? You can basically add, to the kids' incomes and calculate out what you would get. And you would get this orange line here. So consistent with your intuition, you would have higher rates of upward mobility if you had higher growth rates. But you can see that you don't get anywhere close to the 92% rate you saw in 1940, right? You close only something like 1/3 of the gap simply by increasing growth rates if you don't change the distribution of that growth. If you instead did the opposite thing of having more broadly shared growth, so that's this green line here, so that is you maintain the lower growth rates we have today, but you distribute the growth differently, you end up with an average upward mobility rate of 80%. So you close something like 2/3 of the gap. So the lesson from this is that 2/3 of the decline in upward mobility in the US over the past 50 years or so is due to changes in inequality, the changes in which growth is shared, and 1/3 is due to the reduction in growth rates. And so why is that? And I'll end with this. What's the intuition for that? Imagine in an extreme that only one person, say Bill Gates, captures all of the income growth in the US, all right? In that case, you're not going to have upward mobility for the vast majority of Americans, right? Even if you have the same growth rate, but only one person's getting that income, if you ask what fraction of kids are earning more than their parents, that number is going to be close to 50%. In contrast, even if you have a lower growth rate, but everybody is getting some of that growth, you're going to have lots of kids doing better than their parents. And so the extreme changes in inequality in the US have led to a significant reduction in upward mobility. And what we'll talk about in the next lecture is what that means for how we might address the fading American dream. Okay, so to recap where we left off at the end of the last lecture, we were talking about trends in upward mobility in the United States and the fact that kids' chances of going on to earn more than their parents have fallen dramatically in the US, from 90% for kids born in the 1940s to 50% for kids born in the 1980s. And as we talked about at the very end of the last lecture, 2/3 of that decline appears to be due to changes in the distribution of economic growth. So the fact that most economic growth now goes to the very top of the distribution, and in particular, the extreme top of the distribution, people in the top 1% or top 0.1%. And 1/3 of the decline is due to the fact that the American economy is just growing at a slower rate over the past 30 years relative to the rate at which it was growing in the 40s and 50s. Okay, so inequality plays a big role in driving the fading of the American dream. So we've been looking mainly at data for the United States. What I want to do now at the start of this lecture is compare the American experience to trends in other countries. So there's some very nice recent work done by an economist named Jonathan Berman, who applies the methodology that we developed in the earlier paper and used to study the US to a set of other countries to answer this question, to basically look at the same sorts of trends in other countries. Okay, so I'm going to start by looking at this graph from his paper, which basically replicates the analysis that we did in our earlier paper and reaches similar conclusions. So we're going to start by looking at the US. And let me just walk you through each of the 3 different series that you're seeing here. So start by looking at the series in black, which he labels baseline. So that's the actual data based on his calculations that you see in terms of the statistic that we've been looking at, absolute mobility, which is the fraction of kids who go on to earn more than their parents did. And he's benchmarked this in a slightly different scale than the way we do it. So he's set it up so that in 1940, that number starts at 100%. So he's just kind of measuring it as a percentage of what the value was in 1940. And you can see that in the black, he finds a substantial decline where it comes down to something like 55% of the value that it was at in 1940, which remember, in our data, we showed 92% of kids born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. And so he's finding basically a very similar decline, which makes sense. He's using the same data, essentially the same methods, and so forth. So then what he does is consider the same 2 alternative scenarios, or what economists would call it as alternative counterfactuals, for what could have happened in the US economy if we had a fixed level of inequality or a fixed level of income growth. So let's start with the fixed level of income growth. Here I'm just recapping basically what we talked about at the end of the last lecture. So in the blue series, he's considering the scenario where you imagine that you had the same growth rates for the kids born, say, in the 1980s as you did for the kids who were born in the 1940s. So between 1940 and 1970, there was about a 2.5% or 3% growth rate per year in incomes in the US on average. And for kids born in 1980, between 1980 and 2010, the average growth rate was about 1 percentage point lower per year. So what we did in our paper and what he's doing here is basically saying, suppose I take the actual incomes that I saw for the kids born in 1980, but I increase that by basically adding 30 years of growth at an additional 1% rate each year. So I'm basically going to increase your income by something like a factor of 50% or so. And so then I recompute what absolute mobility would look like under the hypothetical scenario where we have that higher growth rate. And what you can see, which is the conclusion that I ended with in the last lecture, is that that does increase rates of absolute mobility, but you still have quite a substantial decline. You wipe out only something like 1/3 of the decline relative to where you started in 1940. Now, if you do the opposite scenario of fixing the level of income inequality, the way in which growth is shared, rather than fixing the growth rate, you get what's shown in the gray series. So what he's doing there is saying, suppose we have the same average growth rates that we actually do in the data throughout, so we have the declining growth, but we chop up the economic pie for kids born, say, in 1980 in the same way that we were chopping up the pie in 1940, which was much more equal than the way it's being divided now, right? What that would give you is the series shown in gray, which, as you can see, yields substantially higher rates of absolute mobility relative to the 1940 benchmark than what we actually see in practice. So that wipes out something like 2/3 of the gap, okay? So that's just him replicating the analysis that we did in the US and reaching similar conclusions. So what we can now do is look at a set of other countries. So one interesting comparison, here's Denmark. So first thing here, look at the scale, right? So if you look at the scale, you see it's only going from 80 to 100 in Denmark. So even though you see a decline in the black line in Denmark, just like you do in the US, it's of a dramatically smaller magnitude. Remember, in the US, we went from something like 100 to 60 or 55, whereas this is declining by about half as much. There's a second key difference, which is you can see that in Denmark, the entire decline in absolute mobility is accounted for by a reduction in growth rates rather than changes in inequality. So if you hold inequality fixed and you look at the gray line, in Denmark, that essentially doesn't change the picture at all. Whereas if you hold growth rates fixed, right, you get a line that's almost flat. So you essentially explain the entire decline in absolute mobility by the fact that the Danish economy has been growing more slowly in recent years on average, rather than by who is getting the gains in Denmark, who's getting the gains, the rich versus the poor in Denmark. And that reflects the fact that growth in Denmark, like in the US, has slowed overall, but unlike in the US, it has not become that much more inequitable. You've continued to have pretty broadly shared growth across the income distribution. Okay, so more broadly, that's a sharp contrast between the experience in the United States and Scandinavian countries. And so now we can look at a few other comparisons. He does this for about 10 countries. So you see Norway and Sweden, kind of similar patterns, smaller declines in absolute mobility. If you look at the series for Sweden in particular, notice the pattern very similar to Denmark, where you have a very flat blue line. Almost everything is explained by the decline in growth rates. If you look at the UK, it looks more like a little bit more like the US, not quite as extreme. So the UK has a pretty substantial decline in rates of absolute mobility, and a good chunk of that is accounted for by inequality, growing inequality rather than the slowing of growth rates. And then show you a few more of these. Canada, France, Germany, again, all of them have that pattern where the blue line looks considerably flatter than the black line, and in particular, declining growth explains more than rising inequality in all of the other countries he looks at, unlike the United States, okay? So the US is a bit of an outlier in terms of both the magnitude of the decline in rates of upward mobility and the sources of that decline coming from changes in the distribution of growth rather than the level of growth, all right? And so the main takeaway from that is that restoring the American dream of high rates of upward mobility, what the US is kind of traditionally known for in some sense, will require, I think, fundamentally more broadly shared economic growth. That is, you need policies that will increase incomes in the bottom and the middle of the income distribution, as was occurring in the middle of the last century. Okay, so before I move on and talk about what those policies might look like, let me stop and ask if there are any questions about the charts that I just showed, the international comparisons. Okay, so what types of policies might actually increase incomes in the bottom and at the middle of the distribution? So I think there are two broad approaches conceptually that you might think about. The first is redistribution. So, what's one simple way that you might increase incomes for lower income Americans? It's just to literally give lower income Americans more money. And how might you do that? By taxing high income earners and transferring that money to lower income people. So of course you hear about this all the time in the political debate. Another way that you might do that is by increasing minimum wages, driving up wages at the bottom of the distribution. So I think of those types of policies as basically redistribution, or after you have a certain set of outcomes in the market, you try to change the distribution of income ex post by taking money from some people and giving it to others, or changing the way basically the pie gets split in the market. So that's one approach. I think there's a lot of sense in it. It's very direct and can be very powerful. A different approach is to try to increase the skills of lower income Americans. So one way you might think about this is like a pre-market approach. Before you get to the labor market, try to increase the skill set of people who are ending up at the bottom of the distribution so that they end up earning more money, okay? And so economists typically call this human capital development policies. So trying to increase people's skills, both so that they themselves get paid more by their employers, and also so that there's kind of an equilibrium effect where you reduce the number of low-skilled workers, thereby driving up wages. So let me just give you a simple example of how that would work. So think about wages for Uber drivers, for example. They might be very low at the moment because if lots of people are willing to drive an Uber, then the price of an Uber is going to get bid down because somebody else is going to be willing to drive at a cheaper rate than you might be willing to, and so the equilibrium wage rate is going to be very low. If, in contrast, a lot of low-income Americans end up having a lot of skills, they can get a job that pays much more. They don't want to drive an Uber. What that's going to end up doing is, even for the remaining people who are still driving an Uber, if they're competing with a smaller pool of people, it will drive up their wages. And so if you have an increase in the level of skills at the bottom of the distribution, that's both going to increase the wages of the people who had that increase in skills and the wages of the people who didn't get that increase because they're competing with fewer other people, okay? And so that's a second kind of conceptually very different approach to trying to tackle the problem of stagnant wages at the bottom and the middle of the income distribution. So I think both of these approaches make a lot of sense, and I don't think they're in competition with each other. People sometimes view the tax and transfer approach as like somehow antithetical to the skill building approach, but I actually think both things can make a lot of sense. And there are strong proponents for each of these views, right? So famously, Piketty and Saez, whose work we talked about in the last lecture on the top 1% income share, they argue that reductions in top income tax rates in the US, people at the very top of the distribution, in the 70s and 80s had to pay tax rates up to 70 or 80%. And now the top marginal tax rate is down to something like 40% for people earning the highest incomes in the US. And so they argue that that trend, combined with the erosion of unions, the fall in the minimum wage in real terms, all of these factors have led working class Americans to fall behind. And so broadly, they argue for kind of shifting towards higher tax rates at the top and increased transfers and increased support for incomes at the bottom. And then a different view is given by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz in the book that we talked about also in the last lecture, The Race Between Education and Technology, where their central thesis is basically that you need education to keep pace with technological change in order to increase wage rates. So their main idea is that until the 1980s, we had a lot of technological progress, but we also had improvements in the skills of humans kind of commensurately. So if you look at things like average high school completion rates or average years of education, just many indicators of education, you see education increasing in lockstep with improvements in technology and increases in global competition, outsourcing, and so forth. So man was kind of able to keep pace with the machine. But what happened since the 1980s, if you look at the historical data, is that, of course, technological change and outsourcing and global competition have continued at the same pace or maybe even accelerated. But if you look at levels of education, they've completely stagnated since that point in the US. And so they argue that if you think about it as kind of a race between these two competing forces, in order to be paid high wages at the bottom of the distribution, you've got to be able to keep up and compete with technology and compete with workers in other countries. Americans were able to do that till the 1980s, but because of changes in government policies and other social trends, lower income Americans have basically fallen behind in terms of their skills. And so their main idea is that we need to figure out how to catch up in that race once again and start investing once again in the skills of lower income Americans in order to close this gap. So two very different views at a big picture level about what we should do. And we will talk in this class about both of these types of methods, essentially, in quite a bit of detail. So we'll discuss both tax policy and its impacts and the effects of education in much greater detail in later lectures. One point I want to make, which connects all of this back to what we've been talking about so far in this class, is that when we think about education, traditionally people think about education as just pure technical skills, right? So learning math and verbal skills and computer programming and whatever else it might be. But I actually think the way we should think about education is much broader than that as it relates to these important phenomena. And so there's a nice paper by Dave Deming, who's our colleague here at the Graduate School of Education in the Kennedy School, who demonstrates this in a recent study by investigating how wage rates vary with both technical skills, so traditional, say like quantitative math skills, as well as social skills over time. And so let me show you that data in this chart here. So what he's plotting here is the growth in hourly wage rates by occupation, classifying occupations into different types based on the technical skills they require, so basically the quantitative math skills they require, below median versus above median, so low versus high math skills, and also based on the social skills they require. So for each occupation in the US, the government does a survey where they ask workers, what types of skills do you require on your job? And so if you're a computer programmer, you get that survey. You might say, I need to know such and such skills. If you're working, as a lawyer, you might report a different set of skills that you need for that job. And so they aggregate all of that data and they classify occupations into different types of skill sets. And so he's using that data to basically look at how wages have changed for different types of occupations. And so I'm start with this orange series here, which shows you what has happened to wages in occupations that require relatively little technical skill and also don't require particularly high social skills. So you might think of this potentially as kind of manual labor sort of jobs where there's neither a tremendous amount of social interaction and it doesn't require particular technical skills. And so what you see there in terms of what has happened to wages is something that's very intuitive and familiar to all of us. If you think about what's happened, for instance, to the incomes of Americans working in the manufacturing sector, you see that wages have stagnated until 2000 and actually fallen sharply since that point for people in that group, okay? So now, a group that you might think has gained more is this next one, where you think about occupations that require now higher quantitative skills, but are not particularly demanding in terms of social skills. And so consistent with what your intuition might be, those occupations have started to pay more over time. There's a significant demand for technical skill in the American economy at this point. So, canonical example would be something related to information technology, computer programming, and so forth. And so there's some gain there, although it's not dramatic. So who's really getting paid a lot more in the US economy now than in the past? It's these groups, the groups that, the occupations that require high social skills in particular. And the way to think about that intuitively is as you think about more and more routine tasks getting automated, if you are basically able to do something that is quite technical, analogous to what a computer or a robot might do, that's not going to pay off tremendously in the labor market now, and I would think especially going forward in the future. Whereas social skills are very difficult to replicate using at least the technology we have available to date. And so it's those groups, it's the occupations that require high social skills where you've really seen wages take off. Those are the set of people who have really captured the returns. And so the point I want to make with this chart is that when we think about increasing education, we shouldn't just think of it as we need kids to have higher math test scores. It's also a much broader thing than that, right? It's about how you interact with people. It's about a set of skills that are more diffuse, that economists sometimes call non-cognitive skills. These things are highly predictive of success in the labor market, and increasingly so. And so the implication of that is that the policies, if we take the golden and cats kind of view of race between education and technology, we don't just mean expand the number of years that kids go to school or try to reduce dropout rates. I think we should be thinking about not just changes in education and training programs, but also the broad suite of things that we've been talking about so far that affect kids' environments as they're growing up, right? So housing voucher policies, access to better resources in your neighborhood, all of these things shape kids' skills in a very broad way once they're adults. And Deming's analysis suggests that all of that matters a great deal for later outcomes, for the growth of wages, and ultimately for the fading of the American dream. So the point I want to make here is that the specific environmental stuff we've been talking about to this point, I think plays in directly to this view that education matters and is one way in which you might think about increasing education going forward. Okay, questions on this? Yeah. 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 So it's a complicated equilibrium, right, where you're basically asking if you've got a set of workers who, maybe currently are driving Uber, now they get a higher set of skills, and so they move up a little bit. Aren't the people who are in that next tier now going to have lower wages? And you're right. you know, basically the bigger the pool of people who can do the job that you are doing, the lower wages are going to be, because firms are going to be able to hire from a very big pool of workers and they're going to compete wages down. You know, the way I think about it is there are lots of jobs in the US, especially when you get to more technically demanding jobs and jobs that require substantial social skills, where if you talk to employers informally, like if you talk to Silicon Valley firms like Google or Facebook, they're perennially complaining about how they're not able to hire enough people and often have to hire people from other countries. And there's a big debate about visas to have workers come in from other countries and so forth. And so my sense of it is, while what you're describing is certainly, you know, a possible phenomenon, in practice, there's enough demand, especially for jobs higher up in the income distribution, that my guess is those effects would be relatively modest. But you're right that, you know, there's no guarantee that when you upskill workers, you won't end up having some negative effect on wages in other parts of the distribution. That intuition is definitely right. Others? Is there a question back here? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, yeah. So great question. Let me take the second one first. So how do you actually increase social skills? I mean, the way I think about it is, you know, think about a lot of the things that we were talking about in the previous lectures where, you know, if you, so like if you look at the neighborhoods where kids have better outcomes, they are less segregated, for example, or they have more social capital, right? So concretely, suppose, you know, we think there's a causal effect of being in an environment that's less segregated, where you're connected to different people on the skills you develop, on the networks you have, on your aspirations, things like that. You could imagine programs like we talked about briefly in one of the earlier lectures, mentoring programs, you know, big brothers, big sisters sorts of programs, or efforts to try to integrate schools that would have an impact on that dimension. So I think about it less as I need to literally have a program that comes in and teaches you social skills. It can't be like that deliberate. I think it's about a broader change in the environment that then ends up affecting the set of skills you have. Now, how exactly you go about doing that in the most efficient way goes back to what I was talking about in the previous lecture about place-based policies. And we don't know yet exactly which types of methods are most effective, but I view it as kind of associated with the same sets of issues and questions. Say your first question again. Yeah, so I mean, tell me if I'm getting your question right. So as wages go up, do you worry that prices will also go up, and so that in real terms, in some sense, in purchasing power, people may not be better off? Yeah, yeah. So, you know, that is also a potential concern. So one thing I should note in everything we've been doing, somebody asked about this after the last lecture as well, so let me just clarify. So whenever we're talking about incomes here, we're always talking about real incomes adjusted for purchasing power. So the way economists usually do that is by using what we call the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, which basically tries to measure how much a given bundle of goods costs at different points in time. So if you were to buy a carton of milk or buy an apple in 1950, it would have cost a lot less in terms of just absolute dollars than buying the same thing today. And so, you know, you might be concerned that as wages are going up, they're not really increases in purchasing power because prices are also going up. But actually, everything we're showing you here is adjusting for that, because when we talk about incomes, we're talking about real incomes adjusting for the changes in prices, inflation adjusted. And so you should really think about this as, in some level, changes in purchasing power. Now, there's a bit of a debate in the economics literature about the right way to adjust for changes in prices. As you can imagine, it's a complicated thing to do, particularly when you have new goods that get invented. So if I'm talking about the price of an apple, I can measure the price of an apple every year going back a long time. But imagine now that I'm thinking about the price of an iPhone or the price of a computer. What am I going to do in 1950 when I didn't have an iPhone at all? In some sense, the price was infinity at that point because you couldn't buy it. And so that creates a bunch of complications in terms of how you actually adjust for changes in prices over time. And that's like an active area of debate in the field, active area of research. But the bigger picture answer to your question is, I don't, while in general there might be increases in prices that are associated with increases in wages, here we're actually talking about increases in wages that outstrip the increases in prices. So think of this as like changes in real purchasing power. And that seems to have changed in the American economy, especially for lower and middle income Americans. They have, in some sense, less purchasing power than their parents did. That's the result that we've been showing and studying. Okay, anyone else? Okay, so what I want to turn to next is to come back and revisit kind of a central premise of a lot of what we've been talking about so far. So until now, we've basically implicitly assumed that our goal should be to increase social mobility. We've kind of like taken that as a given, that yes, of course, we should be trying to increase upward mobility. But if you step back and think about it, it's actually not totally obvious that that is necessarily a good thing. It might not actually be desirable to increase social mobility from an efficiency or economic growth perspective. And so let me give you an extreme example that illustrates why that might be the case. So suppose the pathway to doing well and rising up is to go to a good college. And we'll show some data in some of the next lectures suggesting that that in fact is the case. And so suppose, imagine you take Harvard admissions and you think, as we'll talk about in a couple lectures from now, there are much fewer kids from low-income families at a place like Harvard and Harvard itself than kids from higher income families. And so at some level, there's limited social mobility in that context. So if you think about it from the perspective of college admissions, how could you increase social mobility, increase low-income kids' chances of attending places like Harvard? One way you could do it is just to have random college admissions, right? Suppose you didn't actually evaluate kids' credentials at the point of application, you just flipped a coin and let people in randomly. So that would increase upward mobility because low-income kids would have a higher shot of getting into a place like Harvard than they do at the moment. And in some sense, that would sort of maximize social mobility because your parents' incomes would become totally irrelevant if we just assigned college admissions or assigned incomes in adulthood, jobs in adulthood, just purely by flipping a coin. But obviously, if you just think about that, even though that would increase social mobility, you wouldn't think of that as a good policy, presumably, because it would violate other things that we also care about. So people, many people are interested in having higher levels of social mobility, but people also care a lot about things like meritocracy. The idea that people who have the merit to get the best jobs and get into the best colleges should actually be the ones who get those opportunities. And moreover, random admissions or random allocation of jobs would also likely reduce total economic output and growth. So why is that the case? If you think about just randomly assigning people to different jobs, you may not have the people who have the right set of skills to do a given job, right? And so that's going to be obvious if you take an extreme case like being a computer programmer. If you don't know any programming, then obviously just randomly assigning people to jobs like that, you're going to get much worse outcomes. And so I'm giving you that extreme example not because it's relevant from a policy point of view, but it illustrates abstractly that increasing social mobility by itself is not necessarily the be-all and end-all. It's not necessarily a desirable goal. In particular, we might worry that there's a trade-off between increasing equality of opportunity or tackling issues of inequality and economic growth, because basically you might worry that you're moving away from a meritocratic system by trying to give opportunities to lower income kids who may not have the same qualifications. And so what I want to do next is talk about a set of results that gets at that potential trade-off between economic mobility and growth, focusing on one specific driver of economic growth that's really critical, which is innovation, inventing new things. Most economists think that that's really the central thing that drives economic growth. Okay, and so this is going to be the last set of topics that we're going to cover in the equality of opportunity segment of the class. Okay, upward mobility, innovation, and economic growth.